Not every gun was born to be a legend. Some of them were downright cursed. These cursed guns weren't just bad, they were like catastrophes wrapped in steel waiting to happen. Imagine a weapon so unreliable it seemed almost eager to stab you in the back, misfiring, jamming, maybe even blowing up right in your hands. Those are the guns we're talking about today. Let's start it off with one of the most cursed firearms that ever made it to a war zone. Meet the Nambu Type 94. This thing is like if someone put together a checklist of everything not to do when designing a pistol, then made sure to tick every box. The Type 94 first made its appearance back in 1934 just as Japan was knee-deep in its expansion into Asia. They needed sidearms, and they needed them fast. So, what'd they come up with? Well, let's just say the Imperial Japanese Army ended up with a sidearm that was about as reliable as my attempts to understanding my daughter's TikTok lingo. It is in fact not on fleek, y'all. Imagine trying to defend yourself with a gun that seemed to have a mind of its own. The Type 94 had a short barrel that didn't quite match up to the power of the round it fired, making its ballistic performance more suited for hitting targets at, an arm's length. Anything further and you were pretty much relying on luck. Now let's talk about that trigger mechanism. It was flawed to the point that the gun could misfire before the round even reached the chamber. That's right, this gun was like, why wait for an enemy when I can just surprise my own guy? And if you thought that was bad, let me introduce you to the real kicker, exposed lever on the left side. This little design quirk linked the trigger to the firing pin, and that meant if you bumped the gun against something hard, like say your gear or even the inside of a holster, the gun could go off. Surprise! Nothing like a pistol deciding it wants to make some noise without your permission. It earned itself the nickname Suicide Special for good reason. It's as if they're trying to add some excitement to everyday handling. Some folks even said it was designed for sneaky last-minute shots during a surrender. You know, one of those I'm giving up but not without a final bang moments. But honestly, that sounds more like a myth or an excuse. If a Japanese soldier was really surrendering, he'd probably reach for something more effective like a grenade. Still, the name surrender pistol became part of the legend. Whether or not that was true, the fact that people even believed it tells you everything you need to know about how sketchy this gun was. Japan cranked out about 70,000 of these babies before the war ended, each one a little worse than the last, as their industry was falling apart. It's like they were in a contest to see how bad they could make them, and let me tell you, they won that contest with flying colors. Late war versions of the Type 94 were notorious for rough machining marks, bad bluing, and a complete lack of finesse. Just imagine holding a gun that looks like it was made in someone's basement during a power outage. Not exactly confidence-inspiring, right? Honestly, it makes you wonder how anyone trusted their life to this thing. But hey, when you're out of resources and options, you gotta make do with what you got, even if what you got is a sidearm that's just as dangerous to you as it is your target. They say necessity is the mother of invention, but in this case, it looks like the necessity was the mother of some pretty regrettable firearm decisions. In the mid-19th century, they thought, hey, why not slap that revolver magic onto a rifle for the US cavalry? Well, it went about as well as my attempt at making souffle for the kids. Puffed up nice at first, but boy did it crash hard. This year Carbine looks like something that belonged in the Wild West with its fancy revolving cylinder and long barrel. Came in calibers like 36, 44, and 56, with barrel lengths ranging from 15 to 24 inches. But at a glance, it had all the makings of a showstopper. However, this thing had a dark side, a real safety nightmare. The design flaw you see was all about the hot gases that came spewing out when you fired a shot. These gases like to hang around the other chambers, just waiting for their chance to shine. In this case, that shine is an explosion. It's what we call a cook-off, which essentially means where a live round gets triggered by leftover heat and, well, fires off without permission. Imagine you're just trying to take a well-aimed shot, all calm-like, and suddenly, bam! You got a misfire and possibly a singed arm or worse. Not exactly the kind of surprise anyone wants while taking on the enemy. I don't own one, nor have I ever seen one except for in the movies. They did not use metallic cartridges like an 1873 Peacemaker, and each cylinder was hand-loaded with black powder, a primer cap, and a bullet, like a Navy Colt. Once in a while, more than one cylinder would fire and you could be burned and or shot in the hand. With a handgun, your other hand isn't going to be in the way to be injured, so if more than one cylinder accidentally fired simultaneously, the shooter was not in danger. Now, to give Colt a little credit, they were optimistic. The US Army even adopted it for a hot second, but that honeymoon ended pretty quick. The soldiers were wise to avoid holding the forend with their offhand to keep from losing fingers, or worse, ending up with a face looking like it went toe-to-toe with a hot skillet. I reckon some poor cavalryman was holding it just right one minute, and the next he's inventing new swear words in the middle of a battlefield. Not ideal. Only around 4,400 of these things were made, and honestly, that's good for everybody. There's a good reason that they're not exactly flying off the shelves at your local gun show today. It was a real flashy idea. Revolvers were king, and Colt thought they might just supersize the concept. But as it turns out, when you add that extra firepower, you also get extra danger. Anyway, it's safe to say this carbine was a lesson in engineering overconfidence. Hey, if you're into living dangerously, I suppose it can make for a unique addition to the collection, but you better keep those band-aids handy just in case. Alright, let's go back in time when the Allies wanted to stir up a whole lot of trouble for the Nazis. The plan was to make a simple pistol that resistance fighters could sneak around with, a pistol so small and cheap it could be dropped into enemy territory by boatload. See, in the 1940s, the Allies were looking to throw a wrench into the Nazi machine. Enter the FP-45 Liberator, weighing in at just a pound and fitting snugly in your pocket at 5.5 inches long. Just a little fella, although some might argue that's pretty huge. You'd think something this small, very huge, could pack a little punch, right? Well, it did, if you could manage to use it right. This pistol had the kind of accuracy that made you hope the enemy was standing close enough to count their nose hairs. See, the Liberator was designed for super close encounters. I'm talking 13 feet or less. Now, you might think that's doable, but with a smoothbore barrel, the bullet came out of that gun like it was on a roller coaster. Trying to hit anything beyond spitting distance? Well, you'd have better luck yelling really loud and hoping the enemy got scared. It fired a 45 ACP round, which, don't get me wrong, is powerful stuff. Same kind they used in the Colt M1911. But with the Liberator, it's more like pointing and praying. If you missed your shot, you'd be in for a heck of a reload process. You had to pull out a dowel rod, poke the empty casing out, and load it up again. Imagine doing that all while someone's charging at you. Yeah, no thanks. It's no wonder they called this thing the Woolworth Pistol. It was built from just 23 steel parts and cost about $2.40 to make. Cheaper than a decent dinner date. The whole idea was to drop these off by the boatload all over occupied Europe, hoping to stir up some trouble. And while it sounded good on paper, in practice, this gun was more of a headache than a help. Most resistance fighters probably would have chosen a sturdy stick over this thing, and honestly, I can't blame them. I mean, you fire one shot and that's it, one and done. Now you gotta fiddle with unlocking the breech, dig out your handy little wooden stick, and knock the casing out before reloading. If you're lucky, your enemy is as confused as you are by then, giving you a chance to finish up. Otherwise, you're probably better off running. Reloading this thing under pressure would have made you think twice about throwing it at the enemy instead. And yet, the plan was to distribute these en masse, getting everyone scared that civilians could be packing heat. In reality, most of these things end up being scrapped or fittingly tossed into the ocean. The truth is, they barely saw any real action. And with all the trouble they got, it's probably for the best. This gun was the definition of cursed. It had a purpose, but lacked everything else you need in a reliable firearm like, accuracy and ease of use. The FP-45 Liberator is like that one gadget you bought on impulse. Seemed cool at the time, but once you got it home, you realized it was way more of a hassle than it was worth. The kind of gun that makes you appreciate the simple things in life, like a solid baseball bat. At least with that, you know what you're getting. A pocket-sized piece of history that might have looked good in theory, but ended up being a lesson in why simpler doesn't always mean better. If you were a resistance fighter back then, you'd probably have better luck with a sharp stick and some good old-fashioned courage. Here we've got yet another gun that looked promising but ended up as a nightmare you'd only want to fire once, and then was probably never seen again. Seriously, the stories say even the testers wanted nothing to do with it after the first round. They were a bigger threat to the soldiers who carried them than to the enemy. Now, the Mars pistol wasn't your everyday run-of-the-mill gun. It was designed by a man named Hugh Gabbett Fairfax, who, judging by his persistence, must have thought bigger was always better. He made a deal with Webley, a well-known British firearms company, to manufacture this beast exclusively for him. And by beast, I mean a small cannon disguised as a pistol. Heavy? Check. Complex? Oh, absolutely. It was basically the firearms equivalent of trying to assemble IKEA furniture without the manual. And you might say, Buck, what made it so cursed? Well, the answer to that is everything. But let's start with its bizarre mechanics. The magazine had this steel finger that held the top cartridge, and to load it, the cartridge had to be yanked back and up into the breech. It sounds like it was overcomplicated because it was. Mars pistol was made in 3 calibers, 8.5mm, 9mm, and 45. Fun fact, the 45 version was the most powerful pistol of its time, and by fun, I mean it was so powerful that every shot made you question your life choices. Imagine pulling the trigger and feeling like you've been punched by a heavyweight champ. Yeah, that kind of power. The breech block had this over-the-top rotating mechanism, and let's not forget the external hammer. When fired, the whole thing recoiled along with the barrel, ejecting the empty case usually straight into your face. I mean, nothing says user-friendly quite like needing safety goggles just to dodge spent casings, am I right? And this recoil wasn't just a little kick, the Mars pistol had so much jump that it probably felt like wrestling a wild animal. No wonder those testers decided one shot was more than enough. The British military wasn't a fan either. After multiple trials with the War Office and the Royal Navy, they rejected it. They basically told Fairfax, hey, maybe make it smaller, less powerful, and maybe usable. But Fairfax wasn't having it. He stuck to his guns, pun intended, and refused to make the adjustments. Spoiler alert, his stubbornness did not end well. He went bankrupt, and ultimately only about 70 Mars pistols were ever made. It's like the ultimate what could have been story if only someone had just listened. Huge, clunky, unbelievably complex, recoil so bad that at the trials no one would fire a second shot from it. The only virtue is that ammo is so scarce that collectors fight over it. It's not just that it was overly complex or that it recoiled like it had a personal vendetta against the shooter, it's that despite all that effort, the thing just didn't work out the way anyone wanted. Every piece of this gun seemed determined to be different and not in a good way. It was ambitious, sure, but sometimes ambition leads to an absolute train wreck of a firearm. And hey, at least it's got its place in history. Just not the kind anyone would want to revisit. If you're curious, this pistol's rarity makes it a collector's dream, but let me tell you, there's a reason they're all collecting dust instead of getting fired. Stick around, folks. We've got more bizarre firearms to talk about, and trust me, they only get weirder from here. Picture this. It's the middle of World War I. You're knee-deep in mud, and someone hands you the Fusil Mitrailleur Model 1915 CSRG, a name that's a mouthful and, frankly, a letdown rolled into one. But you might know it by a simpler name, the Chauchat. Let me tell you, this thing was cursed right from the get-go, almost like it had its own grudge against the soldier holding it. Designed back in 1907 and clocking in at a hefty 20 pounds, the Chauchat was the kind of light machine gun that was anything but light. Think about lugging around a toddler entirely made of steel while trying to avoid enemy fire. That's what we're talking about here. It fired an 8mm Lebel cartridge at 250 rounds per minute, which sounds decent until you realize everything else about it seemed like a plot to make your day worse. With over 262,000 units produced between 1915 and 1918, you'd think the French would have ironed out some of the issues. Spoiler alert, they did not. The American Expeditionary Force even took these into the battle while waiting on the Browning M1917. Bless their hearts, they had no idea what they were in for. Now, the Chauchat had an open-sighted half-moon magazine that was practically designed to attract mud and dirt, especially in the trenches of Europe. And if there's one thing a machine gun doesn't like, it's dirt. Feeding issues? Oh, you bet. Soldiers got so fed up, they started underloading the magazine to 18 or 19 rounds just to reduce the odds of a jam. When the best tactic is to use less ammo, well, that is a red flag right there, my friends. Now let's talk about firing this thing. It had a long recoil system that'd kick you like my old mule after a long day on the farm. And the sights? Wobbly and unhelpful, almost as if they were installed to make you miss on purpose. The bipod? Flimsy at best. Oh, and the overheating. You'd think twice about going full auto unless you had a real love for burning your hands. To add insult to injury, the version made for the Americans had even worse chamber measurements. Just what every soldier dreams of, right? Some US soldiers were so fed up with this cursed contraption that they ditched it in favor of, well, anything else. And honestly, who could blame them? The Chauchat became notorious as the worst machine gun of World War I, maybe even of all time. I mean, if you've got a gun so unreliable that your own troops would rather risk carrying no machine gun at all, you got yourself a historical disaster. And despite all that, it was a fully automatic rifle during World War I, and that was a big deal. It was cheap, easy to produce, and anyone with basic workshop skills could slap one together. It was like the precursor to all those low-cost sheet metal guns of World War II, like the Sten or the Grease gun. So yeah, maybe it was a couple decades ahead of its time, but that doesn't really make it any less cursed. Imagine being a German soldier and every sixth guy you see across the battlefield has an automatic weapon, while you're still manually cycling rounds. That's right, this cursed monstrosity may have been awful, but it was there in numbers. And sometimes, sheer numbers count for something, even if it is just adding to the chaos. There you have it, folks, a Chauchat. A gun so frustrating that even history can't help but shake its head at it. If you ever find yourself in a trench reenactment and someone hands you one of these, do yourself a favor. Politely hand it back, grab a shovel, and prepare for a better time. This thing was cursed before it even hit the holster. It's like someone looked at the recipe for a good pistol and decided to replace all the ingredients with bargain bin knockoffs. Picture it. A gun that's supposed to shoot 9mm rounds, but instead of being beefy and reliable, it's like trying to fire a cannonball out of a garden hose. Yes, it's that bad. The Italian army wanted something new, something that could replace their old revolvers, and they ended up with the Gilsenti Model 1910. This was an upgrade of the even weaker gun, the Model 1906, and let me tell you, upgrade is a generous term here. They chambered it for 9mm, but the problem was this poor thing just couldn't handle the heat. Fire a proper 9x19mm parabellum through it, and boom, it's like you're picking pieces of it out of your hand. So what did they do? They came up with a 9mm Gilsenti, a weaker version of the 9mm cartridge just to make sure the gun wouldn't blow up on you. And sure, that solution kept it from turning into shrapnel, but it also meant this thing had all the stopping power of a wet noodle. No joke, you'd probably have better luck just chucking it at somebody. Plus, with only 7 rounds in the mag, you're not exactly walking into a gunfight with confidence. Imagine rolling up to a fight and telling the enemy, hey, can you hold still while I politely poke you 7 times? Now, there was this little removable plate on the left side for cleaning, and that sounds handy, right? Well, not really. The plate would sometimes just pop open mid-fire, kind of like your glove compartment flapping open while you're trying to drive. Let's just say if you're in a pinch and need this thing to keep it together, the Gilsenti probably has other plans. But here's where it all gets really cursed: logistics. The Italians ended up with a pistol that needed its own special ammo that looked just like the German 9mm, but it wasn't. So in the middle of World War I, you've got Italians scrambling to make sure no one accidentally grabbed the wrong rounds and turned their sidearm into a hand grenade. Picture a German Luger or Walther choking on the weaker Italian ammo, or the Gilsenti getting filled with the German stuff and deciding that's it, game over. To make matters worse, all this hassle meant they needed separate factories and supply chains just to keep this thing fed. I'll tell you, there's one thing an army loves, it's having to do double the work just to keep a sidearm operational, said no one ever. Compared to some of the heavy hitters of the time, like the trusty Colt 911 or the Walther P38, this thing was just sad, underpowered, fragile, and prone to falling apart. Definitely cursed by its own design. And that's why it's earned a place on our list of the most cursed guns, because nothing says we made a mistake quite like the Gilsenti Model 1910. Alright, fast forward to the 1960s, and a company called MBA Associates from California had the bright idea of making a pistol that didn't shoot bullets, but tiny rockets. Now I know that sounds cool, like something you'd see in a sci-fi flick, and honestly, it looked the part too. Futuristic and sleek, almost like a DeLorean in gun form. But here's where things start to go sideways. Instead of using your typical inert projectile, this bad boy fired microjet rounds, 6 of them to be precise, loaded right into the grip. And the firing mechanism? Well, you got a hammer that hits the nose of your rocket, setting it off like a fireworks show in your hand. And you'd think firing rockets would make you feel like a superhero, but the reality, well, it's more like a superhero movie with a bad CGI. The Gyrojet had some features that made it a neat concept, sure. For one, its design allowed for almost no recoil. Kinda like holding a Nerf gun, but don't get too excited. The reason it had no recoil is that there's no gas pressure buildup inside the barrel. Not exactly the makings of a powerful firearm. The reason you're not feeling the kick is because it's more like a gentle shove from a toddler. Now, the rounds were about as expensive as trying to buy a first-class ticket to the moon, and if the military had decided to adopt this thing, they'd have gone broke and just trying to keep their soldiers stocked with ammo. And that's not even the worst part. The accuracy of this pistol was abysmal. Once a rocket's fuel ran out, the velocity would just drop like a sack of potatoes. Picture trying to hit a target with a firecracker after it's already sputtered out. Yeah, not great. Then there's the maintenance. If you like tinkering around more than actually shooting, maybe the Gyrojet was for you, but for everyone else, the high maintenance cost paired with its lousy accuracy and price of the rounds meant this gun was about as practical as a screen door on a submarine. The idea was ambitious, and it hit the market in 1965. But let's just say it didn't exactly fly off the shelves, except maybe in a clearance sale. Well, what do y'all think? Would you ever want to try shooting one of these rocket-propelled pistols? And what's the most cursed gun you ever heard of? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this dive into history's weirdest firearms, go ahead and hit that like button. And let me know in the comments if there's any other cursed guns you'd like to hear about.